Hey there, I'm Josh, and welcome back to the Lord of the Rings Artifacts of Arda. In the last episode, we focused on the moment in the film where the Fellowship fought off enemies at Balin's tomb in the Mines of Moria. More specifically, how Sam uses his handy frying pan to go all Rapunzel on some goblins' butts. Following along, we get to see more of the battle against the orcs, goblins, and the defeat of the big cave troll. But not before a bit of a scare for Frodo, getting stabbed by a spear. Luckily, the tricksy hobbit is wearing his nice shiny mithril shirt for protection. The Fellowship gets a brief respite before running off and attempts to escape the ensuing horde. They find themselves surrounded with goblins skittering down like insects from above. The horde of foul creatures then scatters away, much to the momentary delight of Gimli and the horror of Gandalf. For the wise wizard knows what has driven away the horde. A creature of shadow and flame, a demon of the ancient world, a Balrog. The company hastily retreats, making for the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and here is where we see the inspiration for today's video, where Gandalf makes his stand against the towering Balrog, planting firm his iconic staff and declaring,
"You shall not pass!"
This moment is the basis for this project, where I'll be attempting to make my very own replica of Gandalf's staff. Now sure, we've already seen the wizard's staff in the film a multitude of times up to this point, but to me, this is the most iconic moment for it, because that whole scene just plays on a loop in my brain, just over and over again, and has done so for years. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. I'm going to try my best to get this staff as close as possible to the actual size. And to do that, the first thing I did was to print out a template. For the main body, I'm using a handle from an old broken garden rake. And for the head of the staff, I'll be carving it out of basswood. I cut the block down to size, and then cut the collar off the end of the rake handle. Next, I glued the template onto the block. And then since the block wasn't quite big enough for the head of the staff, I cut another piece and glued it onto the side. I clamped it firmly into place, and then let it sit overnight to dry. While the glue was drying, I rigged up a way to sand down the finish off of the old handle, by securing it in the chuck on the drill, and then holding a piece of sandpaper while I spun the handle through it. I've done this several times before on past projects, and I'll continue to do it because it's pretty effective. Once that was done, I put a taper on the end of the handle by repeating the same process. It took a bit of time to accomplish a good taper, but it ended up working really well. Next up was to drill out a hole in the blank that'll be used for the head. I used a Forstner bit to bore a good deep hole. I gave it a dry fit with the handle, and it was nice and snug. Next was to begin cutting down and shaping the blank. I used the bandsaw to remove as much material as possible. Since the head of this staff is pretty oddly shaped and very specific in how it looks, it took quite a few intricate little cuts. But again, I'm trying to remove as much material as possible now, so it'll save me some work here in a few moments. Once that was done, I started figuring out how I'm going to light up the crystal in the head of the staff, because I decided early on that I definitely wanted it to light up. I tried a couple different flashlights out and eventually settled on this one because it's super bright, it has the correct color temperature, and it has a button on the side. I trimmed back the top on the bandsaw, and then figured out which size Forstner bit I'd be using to bore out a hole in the head. Figuring out the correct depth and placement for the flashlight was a little bit tricky, but I got it. The next step was to begin refining the shape of the head, and to do that, I used a rotary carver and an assortment of beers. This part took a while, but it's pretty cool watching it take shape. Once I got the shape pretty well defined, I put away the rotary carver and dusted off my good old trusty wood carving chisels. The goal here was to add some more intricate details, along with some wood grain texture and appearance. These chisels always do a solid job, as long as I keep them nice and sharp. I was sure to add some extra jagged edges and details to these little branches. As for all the other details, I just referenced a bunch of source photos from both the movies and from different collectibles that have been made since then by different companies like United Cutlery and Weta Workshop itself. And I just added my own spin on it as well. Once the carving was mainly done, it was time to repair that little hole that I had blow out the side. To do that, I just patched it with a piece of masking tape, and then I'm going to cover it with some wood filler. I smeared it all over the repair spot, and then while it was drying, I added some more details with the chisels. And with that, the details of the head of the staff were pretty much done, which meant it was time to glue it on to the handle. I applied a generous amount of glue all over the taper, and then I slid the head of the staff into place. I let the glue dry overnight, and then began applying wood filler all over the transition spot to fill it in. I had to do this in multiple layers. If I tried to add all that wood filler at once, it would never dry and it would just shrink and crack a little bit. So I applied some, let it dry, and then applied some more and just repeated that until it was filled out. Once the wood filler was dry, I sanded it all down nice and smooth. Now that the sanding was done, I used my wood carving chisels once again to add some wood grain texturing to make a seamless transition. I went ahead and added some more wood grain texturing along the rest of the staff as well. Some of the natural wood grain will show through the paint a bit, and that's fine, it'll just add to it. For this next part, I didn't film how I did it, but I wanted to show how the flashlight is going to sit inside of the staff. The body of the flashlight is flat on either side, so I made these two little keys out of some scrap to ensure that the flashlight is properly aligned for the button operation. Speaking of which, I drilled a hole through the back side of the head, and I countersunk it a bit so that the button will sit embedded inside the staff and you won't see it. This rubber button cap came right off the flashlight, so I figured why not use it? Now that that was all done, it was time for painting. I applied a single coat of satin espresso spray paint over the entire staff. This will serve as a nice deep, dark brown base. To add some texture and weathering and make it look more realistic, I applied 4 different colors of acrylic paint to a palette and then mixed it up. I then dry brushed it on in varying degrees and color combinations until I got my desired look. This took a little bit of trial and error, which is fine because that's one of the nice things about using acrylic paints. If you make a mistake, you can easily clean it up with water. Once the head was done, I repeated the same process over the rest of the staff from top to bottom. This next part got a little bit tricky for me. Making the crystal. I tossed around a couple different ideas of how to go about making a crystal, but I settled on this: melting down some acrylic gems that I got from the dollar store. My thought was to heat them up until they melted into a liquid that I could then pour into a mold. To help in aiding the release of the acrylic from the mold, I sprayed the inside with vegetable oil. I ran into a bit of a snag here. The acrylic never exactly melted down to a liquid form. It was more like a pudding. I used a spoon to scoop it out of the bowl and then shove it down into the mold the best I could. The whole time I was doing this, I was actually worried that it wasn't going to work out the way I was hoping. It wasn't exactly agreeing with me. However, once I got it apart, I realized it worked out perfectly. The mold itself worked out perfect as well. It was just a piece of PVC pipe that I cut into 2 halves and then coated the inside and outside with some aluminum tape. And the vegetable oil did a great job as well. As for the crystal itself, I think it turned out better than I was expecting. With the acrylic not actually melting down the whole way, it allowed a lot of imperfections when I jammed it down into the mold, which only added to it. I trimmed it down in size at the bandsaw, and then took it to the belt sander to shape it. This crystal needs to look really undefined and old, so I didn't want to go too crazy with the shaping. I took the top ring of the flashlight and taped it to the base of the crystal, and then drilled some pilot holes for mounting. I used a slightly larger bit to drill out the holes to the correct size. Then, I put everything together. I drove 2 screws up into the base of the flashlight, through the ring, and into the bottom of the crystal. I secured the screws nice and tight, and then gave it a test try. The last thing to do was to install the flashlight into the head of the staff. I got a nice snug fit, and it worked out perfectly. I gave it one last test try, and then this staff was done. I can't tell you how thrilled I am with the results that I got on this staff. I just think it turned out beautiful and surpassed my expectations. This staff is something that I've been wanting to do since before I even started my YouTube channel. In fact, just the idea of even making it was one of the reasons that I've started my channel in the first place. So needless to say, now that I've actually made one for myself, it's a pretty satisfying feeling. And don't get me wrong, this is by no means a perfect replica. What a workshop I am not, but for my collection, it does just fine. And who knows, maybe it'd be good for cosplaying too.
You cannot pass! I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arda. Your dark fire will not avail you, flame of Odin. Go back to the shadow. You shall not pass! Fly, you fools!
Sorry, I couldn't help myself there, because this staff and this project and video in general are something that I've been really wanting to do for a long time, and I couldn't be happier with the outcome. I think it's beautiful, and I love how the crystal looks when it's lit up. Is it an absolutely perfect replica? Nope. Do I really care? Nope. I love it, and I think it's great. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. Doggone it, hair's getting in my face. Gandalf does it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe you found it helpful in some way. Be sure to check out some of my other stuff that's going to pop up here in a moment. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Lord of the Rings, Artifacts of Arda.